Nero, the mad emperor, the worst emperor, and even the Antichrist. He's been labelled throughout a lot of history as the go-to man for terrible and cruel emperors, and has often been considered one of the worst men in history. But, as I so often find while doing research for these videos, history can be subjective, and misinformation is rife in common knowledge. In addition, uncertainties are often labelled as facts, and source context is sometimes ignored. Well, with all that in mind, I set out to try and find the truth behind Nero's terror, and see if he really was as bad as we all think he was. Nero was made emperor at only 16 years of age, and was mostly guided by three people: his tutor Seneca, his praetorian prefect Burrus, and his mother, Agrippina. It seems relatively clear that Agrippina sought to rule through Nero, and she certainly was a brutal woman. She murdered her rivals, like she had done to get Nero as emperor to begin with, and even had her own face on Roman coins, a very good indication of how she tried to extend her power and image. At the beginning of Nero's reign, with the help of his advisors, he chose to focus on distancing himself from the unpopularity of the previous emperor, Claudius, and right the wrongs that he committed during his own reign, which earned him popularity both with the people and the Senate. He promised to respect senatorial autonomy, weed out corruption, and end secret trials that only the emperor had been presiding over. It's generally agreed that the first 5 years of his reign were most commendable, and although this was likely due to the influence of Burrus and Seneca, as they made sure that Agrippina had less and less influence in Nero and was eventually forced away. Under these years, Rome was actually relatively progressive, banning capital punishment, reducing taxes, and promoting the arts as a replacement to gladiator fights, although this was more likely due to Nero's obsession with theatre and poetry. He even managed to avoid the temptation of executing senators, which I imagine was quite nice to those who'd been around when Claudius reigned, as he had about 40 killed in all. At this time, Nero himself was getting more and more into his artistic tendencies. While Burrus and Seneca would often regulate how he ruled, he was often left to his own devices during his free time. It's widely believed that Nero detested signing death sentences, and unrealistically suggested abolishing certain taxes. It was in 59 when most historians agree that Nero started going a little off the rails. His mother Agrippina was apparently becoming too much to bear, and Nero famously had her murdered. 3 years later, he had his wife Octavia murdered, in order to marry Poppaea, the woman he had been having a relationship with for quite some time. Later that year, Burrus, one of his two primary advisors, died. Becoming more and more politically isolated and feeling that he had lost his influence over Nero, Seneca retired. In 64, one of the most famous events of Nero's reign happened: the Great Fire of Rome. It's believed to have raged for a week, and burned down nearly a quarter of Rome, maybe more. The legends tell of Nero starting the fire himself, and how he sung while Rome burned, but given that he was in Antium at the time, these legends are nothing more than myths. It's believed that one of the reasons why Nero was blamed for the fire was because he used some of the space made available by it to build a great palace, simply known now as the Golden House or Domus Aurea. In order to shift the blame from himself, Nero blamed the relatively small religious group, the Jews, for the fire, but the Jewish and Christian religions were not understood well, and so both groups were seen as one, and both groups harshly persecuted. While they weren't treated especially well before this event, they were never really persecuted in quite the same way, just treated with suspicion and distance. But now it wouldn't be until after the split of the empire that the persecution would cease. The next year, in 65, slaves alerted Nero about a conspiracy being enacted by a surprisingly wide range of individuals, from senators to philosophers, which would see Gaius Calpurnius Piso assume the role of emperor. Someone, either a slave or a freedman, reported this to Nero, who had the plot put down, and several, but not all, of the conspirators were executed. Seneca was reported to be amongst those who plotted against Nero, and although he denied the charges, he was ordered to kill himself. That same year, it was said that while Nero's wife Poppaea was pregnant, he kicked her to death. Nero apparently regretted this act and went into mourning after Poppaea's lavish funeral. The following years saw Nero fall deeper and deeper into his artistic obsessions, with one outraged legate describing how he publicly performed as a pregnant woman and slaves. The middle and upper classes were now far less favourable towards Nero, and trouble in the empire only increased his unpopularity with these groups. It all came to a climax, and, seeing his assassination around the corner, Nero tried to take his own life, but couldn't do it, apparently proclaiming, "What an artist dies in me." It's generally believed that he asked a servant to stab him in the neck, and, finally, Nero was dead. So all of that was just a quick run through of Nero's reign, with a focus on events that could affect his morality, but all I've included in that is pretty much all we know, rather than what is speculation or opinion. Most of the evidence for finding stuff out about Nero we get from three main secondary sources: the writers Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio, who I've also heard being called Dio Cassius, so we'll just call him Dio. None of these writers are generally seen as particularly reliable, and none of them lived at the time of Nero. Tacitus and Suetonius lived about half a century after Nero, and Dio lived about 150 years after. So why do we use these sources? Well, they're just about the best sources we have, as all the primary sources have either been lost or destroyed, so any surviving sources are scarce and valuable. In judging Nero's character and morality, there's not much we can get from the beginning of his reign. It may have been considered an administrative success, and Nero seemed to be generally well liked by both the people and the Senate, but this success can be mostly attributed to Burrus and Seneca, so Nero gets no points for that. What we do know of what Nero did during this time certainly doesn't speak against him. His apparent reluctance to sign death warrants can't have been a bad thing, and his interest in art wasn't as dangerously obsessive as it seemed to have become near the end of his life. So one of the main things that people bring up to condemn Nero is the murder of his mother in 59, and there are two sides to this moral coin. On one side, his mother had valued him only when he became important for her own power-grabbing schemes, and seems to have been on a constant quest for power by manipulating and using other people. Having someone killed as an emperor isn't anything new, and while that isn't the best excuse, you've got to remember that this is the world that Nero grew up in. If someone in power didn't like someone else, the way they sorted that problem out was by having them killed, and Nero was far less brutal than some of his counterparts in that respect. But on the other side of the coin, he did just have his mother murdered, and given her fall from grace, it seems she didn't pose any particular threat to Nero. Some sources state that one reason Nero had her killed was her constant opposition to Nero's affair with Poppaea, and if that's true, then his reasoning for having her killed isn't great, but it's generally considered that that's not the case. Next on the list was Octavia, and there really isn't much of a positive to this one. The sources all tend to agree that he just murdered Octavia to marry Poppaea, which at least makes it a murder committed out of love rather than one of heartless indifference, but murder is murder and poor Octavia didn't really stand a chance. Now for the Great Fire of Rome. We've already established that Nero didn't start the fire himself, but whether he had the fire started is another question entirely. The writers Suetonius and Dio both write that Nero was definitely responsible for starting the fire, and only Tacitus doesn't directly accuse Nero of starting it, instead saying that he is unsure. Both Suetonius and Dio also write how Nero sang, danced and performed while fire blazed, but this doesn't seem true and isn't widely believed. Remember, all three of these sources are heavily critical of Nero and are all treated as unreliable. And while Nero's absence from Rome doesn't necessarily mean he wasn't responsible for the fire, it makes it less likely. There's also the popular legend that he was playing the fiddle during the fire, but this definitely didn't happen, partly because the fiddle wasn't actually a thing yet. I've also found a couple of sources that mention a great gymnasium built by Nero that was destroyed in a fire, but I couldn't confirm whether the fire that destroyed it was the Great Fire of Rome in 64 or an earlier one. Which is another good point. Fire wasn't exactly new to Rome. It was a city that used fire for a hell of a lot of useful everyday activities: heating, cooking, lighting. The streets were narrow, the buildings were tall. Basically, it was a city that you'd expect to catch fire badly. So with all this in mind, the modern historical viewpoint is that it is unlikely that Nero was responsible for the fire. Nero's response to the fire is also something that must be taken into account. Tacitus, who remember is one who writes very harshly on Nero, describes how Nero returned to Rome after hearing news of the fire in order to organise a relief effort, paying for much of the expensive work with his own fortune. Tacitus also writes how Nero took part in search and rescue himself, often without guards, and spending days searching through rubble for survivors. A couple of sources state how he used his own palaces to shelter those who had lost their homes, including the one he had left in Antium, and made sure that Rome's new homeless were well fed. It is of course the duty of a leader to care for his people, but we can't discount these acts from Nero's morality. Remember, this was all told by someone who has been described as the great accuser of Nero. Nero's response to being blamed for the fire was less admirable, however. Blaming a small, suspicious religious group and presiding over their persecution doesn't really speak well of him. There's also the story that Nero had Christians covered in wax and lit up as human candles to light his garden parties. But this not only seemed a little over the top, but also far too much bother with very little effect. I mean, what a terrible party it'd be if there were just people screaming as they were being burned alive in the corners. And if they were already dead, you're just cooking dead bodies, and that isn't that much better. But that's my own personal view on why you shouldn't burn people alive at parties. Also, I do disagree with it on a moral basis. The very fact that he was accused of the fire is a very interesting point to look at as well, as it shows that by the Great Fire, his popularity had very much declined since he was first made emperor. The Piso conspiracy also shows the decline of Nero's power, and if Seneca really was involved, shows how far Nero had fallen since it was Seneca and Burrus running the empire. Everyone involved in the Piso conspiracy were of relatively high class, and varying roles in that class too, so it's quite a good indication that he had become quite unpopular with the higher classes. But if it was the slaves that informed Nero of the plot to kill him, that could suggest that he was still popular with the lower classes. Perhaps one of the most immediately brutal acts of Nero is the death of his second wife, Poppaea, which is described by all three of our Roman writers, Suetonius, Tacitus and Dio. Modern historians tend to believe this isn't the case, however. Given how unlikely it is that there is any substantial evidence that any of these writers had access to, and Nero's discernible love for Poppaea, the writers should not just be believed in their hypothesis. It's more likely that Poppaea simply died in childbirth, or because of a disastrous miscarriage. Nero's immediate legacy is also worth looking at. Nero's death saw a period of serious instability sweep Rome, including a period of time known as the Year of the Four Emperors. The second of these emperors, Otho, renamed himself Otho Nero, a decision that could only ever have been made if Nero was popular, at least with the Roman masses. The emperor after Otho, Vitellius, also paid tribute to Nero in a great funeral for the dead emperor. While Suetonius and Dio write that the death of Nero was met with rejoicing from all, Tacitus and most historians believe that while the higher classes, most notably the senatorial classes, celebrated the death of Nero, the general populace greatly mourned him, and the acts of some of his successors seem to back that up. In addition, some believed that Nero hadn't actually died, and that he would return, which eventually turned into a kind of Arthurian-style legend that one day Nero would return to the people. So, was Nero bad? Or was he just misunderstood? Well, I don't want to fall into the trap of re-evaluating bad historical figures and making them look like heroes, as Nero was definitely not a hero. Any positives that can be taken from his administrative side at the beginning of his reign can and should be attributed to Burrus and Seneca. And Nero did have people killed, most notably his wife and mother, in addition to blaming the Christians for the Great Fire with tragic consequences. It's therefore hard to argue that he's anything close to being a good person, but his reputation as one of Rome's worst emperors doesn't really seem warranted at all. From what we can say certainly and almost certainly did happen in regards to Nero's reign, it doesn't really look too bad in comparison with other emperors. Even the persecution of Christians was worse with many other emperors. For example, Diocletian, the emperor who split the empire, stepped up the persecution of Christians to an almost systematic level, bringing in dangerously genocidal anti-Christian acts into law. Even Augustus, who is often considered one of the good emperors, did some terrible things to his political enemies. I've talked a lot about Nero's popularity and who he was popular with, and this video isn't about whether or not Nero was loved and who he was loved by. The reason I mentioned this then was because it helps us understand why Nero has been seen in such a bad light. The stories and quiet rhetoric of the lower classes rarely endure the centuries, but the propaganda of the higher classes and Nero's reputation in the Senate is what has lasted, leading to him being misrepresented in history for millennia. By modern standards, Nero was indeed a bad person, but to single him out as a terrible emperor would be unfair. Thank you for watching this week's video. I do hope you enjoyed it, and feel free to subscribe if you haven't already. Remember, it's really tricky to pick apart classical sources and find the truth behind them, so all of this is at least in part subjective, but I've tried to be as thorough as possible. At the end of the day though, evaluating someone's morality is always subjective, so let us know in the comments what you think of Nero. Should he be remembered as one of history's worst bad guys, or has he just been treated unfairly by those who wrote it? Those who are subscribed to the channel already may have noticed that this video is kind of a week late. What I might start doing now is bringing out videos every fortnight, which should give me more of a chance to work on bigger projects like the next Battles That Changed History documentary in the background, as well as other stuff. That's probably what I'll start doing. I hope it's not too much of a bother, and have a wonderful week.